Welcome to our lecture over Chapter 7. Chapter 7 is about maternal health, infant, and child health. Here are the chapter objectives. Summarize maternal, infant, and child health. Discuss family planning and why it is important. Identify consequences of teenage pregnancies. Illustrate the major factors that contribute to infant health and mortality. State the leading causes of childhood morbidity, which is again about disease, and then mortality, which is about death. Identify important governmental programs developed to improve the health of maternal and child health. All right, well, let's introduce this topic. Age is really important when we're talking about a disease or a disorder because oftentimes the disease or the disorder targets a specific population. You know, if you think about sudden infant death syndrome, it targets the youngest members of our society. Or if you think about heart disease, it typically targets the older parts, older section of our population. Although there are obviously people who are younger who are having heart attacks or heart disease, but it tends to be people who are elderly. And so why is that important? Well, if you're going to talk about reducing the risks or targeting an intervention, it really helps to know who you're talking about. So when we're thinking about Alzheimer's, we wouldn't want to focus on the infants, and if we're talking about sudden infant death syndrome, we'd want to not focus on the 30-year-olds because it's not really targeting those. So, we need to define some age terms here. Infants are less than 1 year of age. Most of you probably knew that already, but when we're talking about children, we're going to limit it from those who are not infants, so they're 1-year-olds, and then we're going to stop at 9-year-olds. So once we're talking about 10-year-olds and above, those are adolescents. So, maternal, infant, and child health encompasses health of women of childbearing age. That's important because not just the pregnant women, but women of childbearing age. So that's a big age range there. From pre-pregnancy, before conception, through pregnancy, labor, delivery, postpartum, right after the pregnancy, and then the health of that child prior to birth, all the way up through adolescence, all the way up through 10 years of age. So there's a lot going on there. If you think about that, that's mom before she conceives, during the pregnancy, delivery, after giving birth for the mom, and then for the child. If you think about how it's doing in the womb and then infancy, that's going to include things like learning to crawl, eat, walk, talk, interact with others, stack blocks, pencils, cross the street, all the way up until adolescence. So big age range here. All right. Well, let's talk about maternal, infant, and child health here. We have some statistics that are important indicators of the effectiveness of disease prevention and health promotion services in the community. And so what we have here, this chart on the left, is infant mortality deaths per 1,000 live births. So if you think about a room full of people who are, say, giving birth, in 2000, the year 2000, the year 2010, and then the year 2017. And so obviously the lower that number is, the better. It's a ratio of 1,000 births in this room. How many of them are going to die? How many of those infants are going to die within that first year? And usually it's within the first few months or few weeks even. So in 2000, it was, for the total of among all the races that we're looking at for this, I guess it's just 3. It was, 7 in 2000, and it was about 6 in 2010, and then it was like 5.5 in 2017. So the trend is going down. But what you also can see is that among non-Hispanic blacks, it is significantly higher, and it remains significantly higher through those 17 years. And so while again the trend is going down for non-Hispanic blacks, it's still about twice as much as for non-Hispanic whites as well as for Hispanics. So, and also for Hispanics, the downward trend is less significant than it is for blacks and for whites. So racial disparities still remain a significant issue to try to improve. This chart looks at death rates among infants going back to 1980, and what you can see is that the ratio is trending downward significantly, especially starting here. If you can kind of look with me right here, you see a significant downtrend, from 1980 to 2000. And then in 2000, it kind of begins to slow down. And then it seems like from 2011 on, it kind of flat lines here. There's just not much movement in the last, say, 15 years. Risk factors for poor health include things like unstable economics in the home. So the adults in the home, maybe they have a job in the spring, but then they don't have one in the fall. Lower levels of education among the parents, drug or other substance abuses in the home. These remain risk factors. This looks at death rates among children 5 to 14, and so we're actually straying into the adolescence, but that's what the data shows us. So let's look here. In 1980, this is, do we have one for all? No, we don't have one for all. But what you can kind of see is that the general trend here is pretty, it's heading in the right direction till about 2010. And then in 2010, we begin to level off, and it's kind of just flat. And in fact, in some ways, let's see, this would be Native American Indian Alaskan Natives. In some ways, they actually kind of go up, actually, not down, go up. Again, following the trend of infant deaths, among black children, again, a lot of progress here up until about 2010, and then for here, you can kind of see it kind of begins to trend back up, but it has remained the highest compared to other groups. All right, the family is oftentimes defined by a relationship amongst its members. We oftentimes think about it as birth and marriage, but we also need to include adoption. Some people would say that you can be family members with your pets or maybe close family friends, and that's true. I guess the federal government defines it as birth, marriage, or adoption, so it tends to be the definition that I have in my head there. Families are the primary unit in which infants, children are nurtured, supported, and regarding healthy development. And so while you're going to have a few children that are not going into families after they're born, that's the primary unit in which children are raised in. And there are a lot of things that the family can do to support that infant while it is growing and developing, because that first stage, that first year even, is really, really crucial for things to happen for that infant that are going to help it build a foundation for a healthy life. Right? So something to note today, many more children are born outside of wedlock than they were in the past. And so it's about 40% of children today are born outside of a marital relationship, and that's about twice as much as 40 years ago. Now, you might say, well, that's you're putting a judgment on that, or that's not something that we should be examining, because what's the difference as long as people love each other? The research indicates that unmarried women are more likely to experience negative birth outcomes than married women. So, Well, I'll leave the judgment off. In fact, one of the things about this chapter in general that makes it a little bit more uncomfortable than some is that because, sometimes I'm talking to pregnant students that are not married, or I'm talking to students that have had children outside of wedlock. And so I'm not bringing judgment. I'm trying to just say, well, here is what the research shows. And so if we were going to improve society, then these are our populations that we can, kind of earmark for these people are at higher risk for having negative birth outcomes. And so one of those is unmarried moms. And so let's define unmarried here. This is going to include single women, so people without partners, but it's also going to include those who are cohabitating with the father of their child. Cohabitating women, if you kind of think of this as kind of three categories. Married women, MW, married women, they're going to statistically experience the least number of negative birth outcomes. Cohabitating women are going to be experiencing more of them, even though it's below it, I guess. Anyway, hopefully you can track with that. And then single women are going to be experiencing the most most negative outcomes. And what are we talking about when we're saying negative outcomes? Things like low birth weight and premature birth and infant death. Now, why is that? Why is it that single women and cohabitating women are experiencing more? It likely has to do with the fact that unmarried women, if we were to look at them specifically, unmarried women, especially single women, lack economic support from their partners, from even people outside of their their coupling relationship, and they're lacking support, financial and time support, people to come over to watch the child, help clean the house, things like that. Whereas cohabitating women, the likelihood is that the partner is in the home, hopefully helping with dishes and changing diapers, maybe bringing in some money from a job. Married women are the most likely to have that. So. All right, teenage births. And so teenage births are oftentimes higher risk than non-teenage births. Let me get the elephant in the room out of the way here, because we have a chart here, and that shows that if you look statistically starting in 1990, the number of teenage births has just fallen almost off a cliff here, which is a positive thing, although in America, we love freedom and we want to allow people to have a child when they see fit, and I'm a fan of freedom. It's just that typically the children of teen mothers are at a higher risk for things like being abused or neglected, not having health insurance. The child is at risk of not finishing school, being more likely to be imprisoned, and that's just the child. And then if you look at mom, she is more likely to not finish her education, because having a child and being a high school student or a college student at the same time is very, very difficult. And she's not likely to finish at that time, like with her age group, which is going to put her back in terms of earning potential and in terms of just kind of launching well into adulthood. And she's also likely to not form a stable relationship with the father of the child. And it makes it less likely that she will form a stable relationship afterward. So, teenage pregnancies are more likely to result in serious health consequences for mother and baby. They do not end when the child is born. That's referring to things like the child is less likely to finish school. And a choice to become a parent affects the individual and the community. So I mentioned, like things like about the mom and the child, but also like these children are going to grow up and be tomorrow's adults. And so I think it's imperative as a society that we do everything we can to help those children be healthy people. So if things like they're going to be struggling in school, they're not going to have, or they're less likely to have health insurance as a child, they're more likely to be imprisoned. I think this is actually an opportunity for society to be able to step in and support single mothers so that those negative outcomes are less likely to happen than they are. But also realize that there are less teen moms today than there were in the past. All right, family planning, right? So this is about people determining the preferred number of children that they would like and spacing those children out so that it puts the least burden on mom's body, and it also helps with having a child and kind of raising that child so that it's not as needy of mom and her partner's time and energy, so that when the next child comes along, mom and the partner can dedicate to that child. So, if you think about like the government recommends 2 years in between each child. That's the preferred spacing. So, but if you think about it, if it's just say 9 months, well, like probably not 9 months, but like 12 months apart, like that's a lot. That's very difficult for a lot of different reasons. So that's what family planning is about. It's about trying to help people kind of think kind of proactively into the future. How many children do we want, and when do we want those children? So. Community involvement in family planning and care includes governmental and non-governmental organizations. So having a child is a large decision and requires lots of commitment and time, dedication to having that child and then raising that child. And so there are governmental agencies that help, especially mom. It tends to focus on mom, even though obviously I know it takes two. But there are, family planning organizations. Some of them are government funded and run, and others are non-for-profit private organizations that try to help mom care for that child, space out those children, offering birth control, teaching about birth control, things of that nature. Unintended pregnancies. About half of pregnancies in the United States are unintended, which is kind of interesting to think about, that half of the people running around today were not planned in advance, right? Maybe in the past it actually was higher than that. Maybe people didn't intend to have a child. And if you go back, say 100 years before birth control was as prevalent as it is today, probably a lot more people were unintended. So anyway, about 43% of those unintended pregnancies end in abortion. We'll talk about abortion just a tiny bit here in a couple of slides. An unintended pregnancy is one in which it is either mistimed, meaning the person doesn't want the pregnancy now, they wanted it in the future, or the person didn't want to be pregnant at all. Right? Unintended pregnancies are associated with negative behaviors. If somebody is not intending to get pregnant, then there's likely that they are going to be doing things that maybe they wouldn't do otherwise. So if someone is not planning on getting pregnant, maybe they're going to be using more drugs and alcohol, that maybe they're doing more unhealthy behaviors that doesn't make their body the ideal place to create a child. And so other things like maybe after they even realize that they're pregnant, they may be less likely to get prenatal care because they're thinking, I didn't really want to be pregnant anyway, I don't want to go to the doctors, and so less likely to get prenatal care and follow through on recommendations like taking, the horse pills that they prescribe as vitamins for pregnant women. So they're less likely to gain the adequate weight that is recommended. They're more likely to smoke and use alcohol and other drugs. Okay, so the government has stepped in, and one of the ways that they've stepped in is by doing Title X, which is a Family Planning Act. This bill goes all the way back to President Nixon, and it provides funds for family planning services, specifically targeting low-income people because they are least likely to have access to birth control and least likely to plan their pregnancies. So it aims to reduce unintended pregnancies by providing contraception and other reproductive health care services to low-income women. It supports about 4,000 family planning clinics in the United States, and approximately 4 million women a year receive care at those clinics. There's a gag rule that was enacted in 1984, and what the gag rule is that it either gags or doesn't gag the people who are providing these family planning services from talking about abortion. Now, Title X does not provide funding for abortion services. It just, when there's a gag rule, the health professionals cannot talk about abortion, and when the gag rule is rescinded, which typically happens if there's a Democrat in control of the presidency, if there's a Democratic president rather, he will get rid of the gag rule, and if there's a Republican in office, they will enact the gag rule. Evaluating the success of community health family planning programs. And so are these effective? Are they worth paying for? The indication of the research is that yes, they are effective. They are worth funding. They have shown large reductions in the number of unintended pregnancies, abortions, and births. Publicly subsidized family planning clinics help prevent 2 million unplanned pregnancies that would have resulted in, now it's tough to know the future, but if you kind of just statistically say, well, the best indication of the future is the past, and so they probably would have resulted in 936,000 unintended births and 673,000 pregnancies. It's estimated that every public dollar spent on family planning services saves the taxpayers $7.09. All right, abortion. This is obviously a controversial issue. I'm going to stay out of the weeds best I can here. Abortion is the purposeful expulsion of the fetus out of the pregnant woman. It has been legal in most states since 1973 with the landmark Supreme Court case of Roe versus Wade. However, this past summer, the Supreme Court canceled, that's not the right word, but it went back and said, no, we're reversing the decision of Roe v. Wade. And what that does is that it allows states to choose whether to provide abortions to the people of their state, right? Depending on how the question is worded, most Americans do support abortion in some form, but it's going to be different if you say, like everyone should be able to receive an abortion, immediately. You're going to get less people supporting that. But if you were to word it like sometimes abortions should be available to some people under some circumstances, like rape, then you're going to get a lot more people that are going to support that. So the majority of abortions occur among unmarried women, 85% of those, but they also occur not among teenagers, but among women who are ages 20 to 29. That's where the lion's share of the abortions are occurring, and the rates are highest among non-Hispanic Black women. So pro-life people tend to view the life of the fetus as more important than the freedom of the woman to choose I can't even say these words without seeing my audience. Whereas the pro-choice camp tends to elevate the choice of the woman regarding the life of the fetus over the fetus's life, right? So I think that we've so politicized this topic that oftentimes we can't even find the right words. We can't even find common words to be able to discuss this issue. But I would say, while there are people on the extremes of both camps, I think it's just helpful to realize a lot of people are much more similar than they are different. And so one person is just like, I understand, they'll say like, I understand choice and freedom and the fact that we don't want, primarily male politicians, controlling women's bodies like they have historically, but I still think that like the life of the fetus is more significant than the choice. And other people would say, I understand the idea that the fetus, could be considered a human life, but I just want to elevate the choice of the woman as, it's her body and she gets to choose what happens to it. And so these people are actually like, you're typically have a lot more in common than the politicians might otherwise say. And I think that's good news, because I think that you could have common understanding and then do things together rather than, like very much like one against the other, which is typically how it's portrayed. Maternal health. Let's see. The effect of pregnancy and childbirth on women is an important indicator of health. Pregnancy and childbirth is can be a very difficult and costly occurrence in the health of a woman's body. Right? Pregnancy and delivery can lead to serious health problems, including maternal death. And maternal death, mortality and morbidity rates are currently about 17 deaths per 100,000 live births. So, kind of going back to this idea of you have 100,000 women who are giving birth, and how many of them are going to die in the midst of that? Well, it's currently about 17, right? While this rate is too high, ideally you'd have this number drop to 0. In low-income countries, the rate is about 40 times what ours is. And even in this country, if you think about what's going on in poorer countries, well, if you kind of bring those conditions and look at them in this country among those who are in poverty and have limited education, well, the rates among those individuals are higher. Okay, preconception and prenatal health care. So preconception care is going to be care that is provided to both men and women to promote their health prior to conception. Conception being the meeting of the egg and the sperm. And this is obviously going to be targeted to a large number of people, even people who would say, you know what, I'm not planning on having a child right now, or I don't ever want to have a child. Because remember, only half of pregnancies are intentional, are planned for. And so it's really about looking at basically everybody who's of childbearing age, which is going to be, starting in late teens, all the way up until about in the early 40s, and saying, what can you do to make women and men healthier so that they are going to be having healthier children? So prenatal health care is medical care from the time of conception until the birth process. Early and continuous preconception and prenatal care leads to better pregnancy outcomes, and they're less likely to give birth to a low birth weight infant, which is one of the most common issues and is a higher risk for that child. Okay, preconception and prenatal health care. Who is getting prenatal care? That's what this looks at, and it breaks it down based upon the education. Well, I'm assuming it's of women. Maternal education, yeah, that's women. Otherwise, it would be paternal. So, I guess the first thing that stands out here is the fact that there are a lot of people who are not getting prenatal health care in that first trimester. In fact, about 25% of pregnancies don't get any prenatal care. Right? So Fortunately, many people do get, at least in the second trimester, if you break the pregnancy into 3 parts, and just in the very beginning, I think it's the first 3 months there, only 75%, or about 75%, are getting that. So if you look at people who have low levels of education, less than a high school diploma, now the numbers really drop. And now you have a lot, a little over half are getting prenatal care in that first trimester. And so if you look at the most educated people in our society, for them, the vast majority, 86% of them, are getting prenatal care. Although, there is a significant portion, about 3%, that are either getting none or only getting it in that third trimester. So, all right, moving on to talking about infants specifically. Infant health depends on many factors. Those include things like how healthy is mom before she gets pregnant and then during her pregnancy. The genetic characteristics that the infant inherits from mom and dad, how much prenatal care mom got. Did she just go to 1 or 2 appointments? Did the doctor prescribe her folic acid? Did she get the folic acid? Did she take it on a regular basis? Did she do Lamaze or other, like yoga-like exercises? Was she supported emotionally from people, around her? So that quality of the delivery, the infant's environment after birth. So what kind of a home and family environment is the child going home to? What kind of medical services is that child receiving during that first year? The nutrition that it receives, is it being breastfed? Is it being fed formula? And then immunizations for that child. All right, looking specifically at infant mortality, which is unfortunately, some infants die before they reach their first birthday. It's a measure of the nation's health. If you think about how healthy is one country versus another, and you look at the most vulnerable in the population, well, it's probably the infants, because they're not able to care for themselves. They're not able to, pull themselves up by their bootstraps or go to the doctor when they need to. They're completely, dependent on the other people around it to care for it. So fortunately, we have had a decline in infant mortality due to things like the fact that we have more economic growth. We have a larger economy. We have more money flowing into our healthcare fields. We have more research being done to understand what causes infant mortality, and then we're able to make changes because of that. If we were much poorer, then it's likely we would have higher infant mortality rates. So we've improved sanitation, understanding about washing hands and how bugs and germs are spread. We have advanced clinical care. We have specialists who are able to care for, say, premature babies. We have improved access to health care. It's part of Healthy People 2030 and then 2020 and 2010 and so on, to have all people have access to health care. And so that's improved the infant mortality rate. And then we have better nutrition. We have more people who are promoting breastfeeding and things of that nature. So the leading causes of infant death are congenital abnormalities. Congenital abnormalities affect about 3 to 4% of all babies in the United States, and these affect how the baby looks, how they develop, how they function. And congenital abnormalities are problems that are caused before the child is born. And other leading causes of infant death are things like preterm or low birth weight babies and sudden infant death syndrome. About half of all premature births are of unknown cause, but there are these risk factors, things like low birth weight, and maternal smoking is one of the most common causes of infant mortality and morbidity. Alcohol and other drugs There is no level of alcohol during pregnancy that is known to be safe, but the adverse effects are most strongly associated with heavy consumption during the first few months of pregnancy. So, breastfeeding is recommended exclusively for the first 6 months of life, and then continuing on through the end of that first year. I'm assuming that, at that point, after the 6 months, there is supplements with more solid foods for that child. The rates of breastfeeding are highest among college-educated women who are 30 years and older and married. And then sudden infant death syndromes, or otherwise known as SIDS. Oftentimes it is unknown what causes this, but again, it's going to be higher among people who are, or among, when these situations are happening. Well, not that breastfeeding, but the first 3 bullet points there. Okay, for child health, good health during childhood years is essential to a child's optimal development, especially brain development. They really say that those first even 6 to 9 months, there's just a lot going on in an infant's brain that is difficult to make up afterward. So, and then a medical home is recommended. A medical home is a term that a book uses to refer to the provision of continuous, comprehensive, coordinated, family-oriented care. And so this would be, not just a one-off appointment here or there, but it is continuous. You're going in for one appointment, the doctor's saying, I recommend that you come back in a month, and if there is care that needs to happen outside of, say, that the committed physician, that the physician is coordinating that care, helping to set up those appointments with the other specialists, maybe a physical therapist or occupational therapist, that it's family oriented, that you're not just focusing on the child in isolation, but you're also talking to mom about her nutrition or other things that are going on in the home that could be help to support that child, right? Talking to the mom, not just about immunizations, but also about growth and development and what to look for, and parenting and nutrition. So all those kind of good things that have traditionally come with maybe like the older style of physician, but that are oftentimes lacking when the parent is part of just a big system where they see one doctor one month and another doctor the next month, and there's just not a whole lot of continuity or relationship building there. Childhood mortality. It is the most severe measure of health in children, right? So obviously a child dying would be the most, the worst thing that could happen to a child. The rates have generally declined in the past few decades, so that's obviously we're doing something right. I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that we are much more serious about motor vehicle safety than we were in the past. I remember as a child, and we didn't wear a seatbelt when we were in the vehicle a lot. We spread out blankets and had stuffed animals and games in the back of the van. And while that was fun, and I kind of missed that, I also realized that if we were to get in an accident, we would be, very bad things would happen compared to if we would have been, in a seatbelt, or if we were being in a car seat, probably even the best. And so obviously the motor vehicle deaths is one of them, but also drownings, fires, falls, burns, and poisonings are other leading causes of childhood mortality. Unintended injuries, right? The leading cause of death among children. There's not very many murders, obviously. Childhood mortality. Childhood morbidity would probably be the better way of putting this rather than mortality. Child maltreatment. And, this would be things like abusing or neglecting a child, everything from slapping and burning, or just neglecting, leaving that child alone, letting the child fend for themselves in terms of feeding itself. Those things can have lifelong consequences, because if you think about it, the child is developing and its brain is kind of learning about the world, and if something traumatic happens to that child, like it's locked in a closet or something like that, it can actually alter the way the brain is developing, and there's assumptions about the world that are made based upon a child's experiences. And so there's been like a lot more research in the last 10 or 15 years about trauma and how it affects our brain. So infectious diseases are another thing, with the emphasis on sticking with an immunization schedule. All right, community programs for women, infant, and children. And so what is happening to try to do what we know is best for women, infant, and children? The federal government has a multitude of health programs that are spread out and over a lot of different agencies to serve the needs of the nation's children. And so while in some ways that's good, because you have a lot of different programs that are set up, and so if somebody misses one program, they can get picked up by another. But oftentimes people are confused. Do I go to this person or this agency for this thing? Or you go there and like, no, this is just for women who are in a certain income category, and you're not in that income category, so we can't serve you. And so sometimes what ends up happening is that people fall through the cracks because it's so kind of chaotic, and people don't oftentimes know where the resources are located. All right, Title V. This is the only federal legislation dedicated to promoting and improving the health of mothers and children. This is going to target the health care for women and children, especially among the poor, and it's going to promote health and reducing infant mortality and preventable diseases. And underneath that is the Maternal and Child Health Bureau, and it's just about administering and spending those dollars. WIC, Women, Infant, and Children Program. This is designed to provide nutrition and health-related goods and services to pregnant, postpartum, and breastfeeding women. This is for infants up to age 1 and children under age 5. That's kind of confusing. I think it'd just be better to say that it's for women, and it's for children 0 to 5, right? Or 0 to 4, under the age of 5. And so occasionally you'll see in the grocery store something like, I think, a peanut butter that'll just say WIC, qualifies for WIC. This is a WIC eligible item there. It's sponsored by the USDA, which is the United States Department of Agriculture, which is the same agency that administers food stamps. Established in 1974. In order to qualify for that, you must be a residency of that state for which you are applying, and you have to make less than 185% of the poverty line. So it's going to include people who are poor, but also people who are, say, almost poor. They make a little bit more, but usually not enough to really, be able to make it without some outside help. And then people who are at nutritional risk. So in 2019, there was about 6.5 million participants in this program. Is it effective? So this chart actually is pretty encouraging if you believe that breastfeeding children is really important, which the research shows that it is. And many people mothers start breastfeeding, but then will stop. But again, remember, the recommendation is that women continue up until that child is 1. So this chart looks at breastfeeding for infants who are 6 to 13 months, so just over that 1 year mark. And what you can see here is that the numbers for the people who are enrolled in WIC is very high. Now, I don't have the numbers for the people who are not enrolled in WIC, but I'm pretty sure they're probably about half of the numbers that we're looking at here. So WIC is really successful, at least in this one measure of looking at how much is the program able to convince women or help women. It's not always about convincing, sometimes it is, but sometimes it's about just supporting women and helping them to breastfeed their babies. And so the numbers here are higher, although there's a lot of variation. If you look at Texas, even compared to its neighbor Louisiana, it's half the amount in Louisiana. So, and it's kind of low right here. Mississippi, Alabama. There's a lot of poverty here. I'm assuming that's part of it. Tennessee is also really low, whereas more of like your more highly educated, richer states up here in the Northeast are much higher. But Illinois is good. Missouri, 72. These are great numbers. So WIC is doing something. Providing health insurance for women. Health insurance for women, infants, and children. Children without health insurance are more likely to have necessary care delayed or receive no care for health problems because going to the doctor is very expensive. And health insurance companies oftentimes actually send letters encouraging families to bring their children to the clinic. So there is two programs that we're going to talk about here. There is Medicaid and CHIP. Medicaid is targeting low-income individuals and families, and it's the single largest provider of health insurance for children in the United States. CHIP is targeting uninsured children who come from families that are not below the poverty line. They wouldn't qualify for Medicaid, but they're not rich either. So it's kind of those families who are above the poverty line, which actually encompasses a lot of families. Last slide here, looking at providing child care. The United States is one of the few countries in the world that does not provide paid time off for the family who is going to have a child. We did pass a law, I think back in the 1990s, called the Family Medical Leave Act, FMLA. And what that does is it gives 12 weeks of unpaid job protection to men and women after they have a child or adopt a child or there's an illness in the immediate family. But it doesn't affect everybody. It only affects businesses with 50 or more employees, and the woman or man has to be at that job, I think a year before they would qualify for that. And so realize also that there's no money. It just kind of like holds the job for the person while they're out. And so childcare is actually a major issue for many families. I think it actually also keeps people from having children because they don't know how they would afford to have another child because having a child is expensive and what are you going to do long term but also short term because you're taking maybe 2 months off to have that child and for the woman to recover and money is a real problem for many people, especially if they don't have banked sick time or vacation time, things like that. And so there's a lot of opportunity for the government or even the private sector to step in and open up childcare facilities for working parents to help them out in that. So, alrighty, well, that is the end of this chapter.